All right, appreciate you guys joining today. We're going to cover change and configuration management, why you need it. I will preface this with the majority of this presentation is really going to focus on change management. Configuration management will play a smaller role. I'll kind of explain why as we go through it. It's not to diminish configuration management in any way, but it's honestly such a large topic. And most companies are more familiar with the change process that we're going to focus on that today. Everybody knows me, so should be no need for additional introductions. And then before we get started, give you a second to kind of look over the agenda. Okay, so first and foremost, what is it? Why is it important? Change and configuration management's a process or program, depending on how you want to describe it within your organization, where you're managing all your changes and all the configurations within the environment. Now, one thing that kind of comes up that gets a little confusing is that every organization, depending on their maturity and how much they follow a strict ITIL type process, they may use terms interchangeably to mean the same thing. That's not the case. Change management is different than configuration management, but a lot of times, just like in today's slide deck, you will see it called change and configuration management, and the abbreviation CM will be used. Why this is important is that if you're going to use CM interchangeably for these, you're going to need to make sure that you're providing clarity or asking for clarity when working within your organization on a program. What CM means to you might mean something different to someone else, and what stakeholders are expecting in return from your program will be vastly different. And depending on if we're talking about change and configuration management, we're going to have a mixture of technical solutions, different hardware, software configurations, new processes and procedures, and then the people element. To be upfront and transparent, change management tends to, again, be the one that more organizations will implement first or attempt to implement. It's typically heavier on process, procedure, people, whereas configuration management is typically heavy on software, having some form of configuration management database, usually inside of a ticketing system or another platform. So while they both overlap in many ways and can have all the different criteria there that's in that bullet, just understand that one tends to be more people process versus technical. And then if you're unaware of the current state of your environment, you really can't make changes, determine if changes have occurred. So one of the things that we see frequently is whether you're patching based on vulnerability management, you're implementing an upgrade to a piece of software. If you have no idea and have not documented what your current state is, then you truthfully will not know when a change occurs. At a high level, that's extremely important because you won't even be aware that a change occurred. But then if you wanted to dig down deeper and say, was it intentional? Was it expected? Did it deliver the investment or return on investment that we were expecting? You will have no idea if that's taking place. Mix that up and make it even muddier, add in security and compliance requirements, things like federal government requirements, CMMC, if you have ISO, HIPAA, things like that. You won't have a way of meeting a lot of those controls, and you won't have a way of providing evidence to your auditors that you are in control of the change and configuration management process. So a lot can go wrong without a program like this. These are in no particular order. I just tried to brainstorm and put up all the things that I think are kind of a must in a program. These are very high level, so each one of these in and of itself could likely be a project that could have its own costs, time implications, resources, deployments, etc. But at a high level, you are going to need documented policies, procedures, and processes. You can't really have a program if it's not documented. People don't know where to go to read about it. You can't train them. You can't provide that as an evidence to an auditor, etc. And then specifically for both programs, even though it touches more on configuration management, you need to have a documented baseline. So again, we have to know the state of our systems and applications before a change is made, so that once changes are applied, we can update it and know what effect it had. You need to have updated, up-to-date, inventories. This is typically asset management. You can do this in any myriad of ways that you want, some being free with licensing that you might already have through other vendors, all the way up to buying your own systems to take care of this. Likely depends on the size of your organization and the budget you're willing to spend on it. At some point, as you go through each one of these items with your team and your organization, you're you should go and do kind of a cost analysis, cost benefit analysis on each of these. You may not want to put out the capital expense upfront for a piece of software or a platform, but you would definitely want to look at what are the hours that are involved to maintain the same outcome without that platform, and see with the number of man hours that you're using and the cost that you're paying each one of those man hours over the course of the year, would it have saved time, headache, and money to have just put it into a system that was bought off the shelf instead. You're going to need a method for requesting changes. Typically, we call this a change request form, but again, everybody in every organization in different countries may call it something different. We'll refer to it as a CR for the sake of this presentation, but a change request form is that formal process by which you are going to request a change. You will likely need to establish a change control board for project-related items, or a change advisory board for service lifecycle support, each board member having assigned roles and responsibilities. This is another commonly interchangeable term where some people will just say, oh, we have a CCB or we have a CAB. They don't necessarily break it out for project or life cycle, especially in a small organization. You might just have one board. That board does not have to be the same as a board of directors for an organization. It could be a simple 2-3 person team that says, hey, all changes need to come through us. We need to review and approve or decline. The bottom line here is what you need is a group of people who are going to review changes and make decisions. And then you're going to want to have documentation capturing the requested change. What's its impact on the business if you approve it versus if you deny it? Input from other teams. I'm going to throw security in here as an example on a few slides where changes are often pushed through a change board without ever consulting security. There's different effects that creates. If you're in a software development organization, it's profoundly huge, because you're likely going to have to go back and recode and retest everything that you built. So you might as well just put change security in the change process up front. If you're just making changes to firewalls through routine maintenance, security may seem like something that you don't have to go through, but it's worth going through to see, hey, is the next version of the firewall I implement going to open a vulnerability? One of the things that we see frequently on the security side of the house is every time you try to remediate one vulnerability, you potentially open up another. And at some point, you should want someone in the security field to look at that and say, is the current vulnerability a higher risk than the one I'm about to move to? And then you're going to need a list of approvers. Like I said, it could be 1, 2, 3 people. Ideally, I would say you want at least 2 to 3, never 1. And if you're going to have a small team and a small organization, you don't want the same person who's able to create the change request approving it. So in a small organization, let's say that you put 3 people on this panel, then the 2, if one of those panel members is the one submitting the request, the other 2 should be voting whether to approve or deny, because obviously the person putting that request in is going to ask for the approval and would approve themselves, but it doesn't mean due diligence has occurred. This creates a separation of duties, which your auditors will also appreciate. You're going to need a documentation repository. Specifically, this is more audit-based, although obviously this is going to benefit any company. You need to have a place to put meeting agendas, meeting minutes, the change request form itself, the template, all the submitted change requests, all the approved, all the denied. There's a third kind of category, which is like a pause, and I'll talk about that a little later as well. But those are requests that go in with the intent that they will be approved, but they're going to need to be delayed for a myriad of reasons. So those need to reside somewhere as well, so that you don't lose track of the fact that you actually haven't received an approval or a denial. And then the software necessary to enforce baselines. This, again, really focuses more on the configuration management side, because you have to have that baseline and then a tool to enforce it. It's a QA to your change management process and procedures in the program, but it can be difficult to find the right software to do this. It can be costly. So there are a lot of organizations that will not put the time and money into this component, and again, focus on the change process and then hope through an honor system that everyone's following it. Again, I'm not going to advocate for one or the other, but most organizations I've seen seem to go with the honor system. When people fill out the change request forms, it appears in my experience that the process is being followed. When they put in emergency change request, you can see it kind of break down because while called emergency, it's typically someone forgot to do it, doesn't have time to meet with a board. They've already scheduled a maintenance window, so they're calling it an emergency. And a lot of times steps are skipped just because of the time crunch they're in. I don't recommend doing it that way, but it's just something that happens day to day. And then I wanted to bring in some control language. If you were, hanging out with me last year, going through all the CMMC control families, we went through a change in configuration management family. These were the 9 controls. They've been summarized, so they're not exactly as presented last year. But I wanted to put those up there because these are also not in a particular order, other than these were the order that they were listed in the NIST documentation. But it's important because if you're going for something like CMMC, or you're going for another audit that's going to rely on a NIST special publication, or another vendor like ISO, who's going to have almost the same verbiage, and you can pretty much guarantee that they're both going to want to see the same types of behaviors take place, then you have to meet these requirements. And as you read through these, you can see that we're going to go, again, like we just talked about, everything from establishing a baseline and an inventory through the process of tracking, approving, and analyzing. The big idea here to take away from this slide is that if you're skipping a step that we talked about earlier to save time or money, you're likely putting yourself at risk of not passing your audit. So again, if it were me and I'm in your shoes, I would go through and look at what are the costs of those things that I'm likely to skip or diminish because I don't think they're important. And then what is the cost to remediate that from an audit perspective? If it's going to cost you more to remediate it because your auditor won't pass you, then you should just implement it to begin with. And again, from a security perspective, obviously, I believe all of these things should take place all of the time. But if we put our business hat on, we know that folks sometimes will have to cut corners to some extent, at least initially, and the intent is to mature over time. If that's the case, then you need to look at the items that are either going to have the least amount of impact to you in case something goes wrong, the things that aren't going to cause you to fail an audit that you might be trying to go for, or let's say you're working for the federal government, things that wouldn't preclude you from being awarded a contract and or maintaining that contract. So again, my recommendation, go through here, and if you cannot do something, really prioritize what you can and can't do, and look for a roadmap as to when can you get it approved in the environment. All of these items have one other aspect of it, which is you're going to need someone or some group of people to maintain this, whether it's updating templates and documents every year so that an auditor sees the evidence that you at least reviewed them and updated them, whether it's looking at baselines, whether it's approving changes to baselines within the software component, number 9, enforcing behaviors. All of that takes people, even if you have tools in place. So you will have to allot for that and make sure that you have not only the right number of people, the right amount of time allocated in your fiscal cycle, but that they also have the knowledge to be able to do this. If they don't, or you feel like this is too much, effort and too much cost, then you want to look to outsource it. I wanted to switch topics for a couple slides here and talk about compliance and security, and then we're going to pull it back together with change in configuration management in a minute, but to give you yet another lens on how you should be approaching this topic and this idea of creating a program. These are my definitions. They're based off of what I've seen historically for over 20 years. You may have a different definition, but at a high level, compliance is often just seen as checking a box. You are having to show these auditors a willingness to meet their requirements in whatever control, whatever framework that is. You need the ability to answer cybersecurity questionnaires. Most of you have already probably obtained cybersecurity insurance, or at least looking at it. And insurance providers are going to ask for these things to make a decision as to whether or not they even will carry you, as well as what your premiums will be. And also, I think from a behavioral cultural perspective, it conveys a sense of security to the organization, right? When you say we're meeting all of these checks and balances, people feel safer about themselves, their data, the data of their customers, et cetera. Your clients and regulatory bodies are obviously going to appreciate this as well, even if it's not a mandate. That being said, security is often described more in a means of reducing risk. You're mitigating or remediating vulnerabilities, reducing your attack vector or your attack surface or attack footprint, whatever you want to call it. And it's often associated with the technical aspects of compliance. So as an example, I wanted to throw a few things up here. If I look at compliance specifically, you can create an acceptable use policy. Now, I'm just picking acceptable use. It could be any policy procedure. But if I create this document only and I put it in my document repository and show it to my auditor, I may be checking a compliance checkbox. And depending on what type of audit you go through, the auditor might be satisfied with the policy, and there's kind of an honor system that you're actually enforcing that policy. Others may require the actual evidence from the security piece. But again, at a high level from the compliance side, all you're doing is putting something in place to check the box. You move to security, and using a different example, you may have a visitor sign-in station when you first come into your physical office. Maybe there's a person there who, when you buzz the door, they let you in, and then you have to sign in. You might get a visitor badge, depending on whether or not you're an infrequent employee, a building vendor like an HVAC company, or just someone who's never been there and is going to see someone. There may be a different level of escort, a different type of badge. Some may be escorted, some may be not. But again, you create that process and procedure. You put it in place, you have it staffed, you can show evidence that you're doing it, but maybe you've never actually written a physical security policy, or you've never written a visitor policy. So in this case, you don't have anything that's documented. Maybe it's not documented well, maybe it's a different process per location based on what your building has. But from an employee standpoint, the only reason that they know this exists is when they walk through the door, they have to have a badge. This is a good example of how you're creating a security reduction in security risk and reducing your attack vector, but you haven't done anything to actually meet the compliance requirement. So likely an auditor comes in either one of the first two examples, and you're going to get a partially compliant response. And then the third combines both, which is, let's say that you're regularly conducting vulnerability scans, you're taking those vulnerability reports and you're remediating the known vulnerabilities, you document the entire process, you train your employees, and you collect the evidence for auditors in a central repository. At that point, you've done both. And you'll check the box completely, provided you're doing it to the level of frequency and expectations that the auditor and the framework has. So how does this tie back now to change and configuration management? Well, if we use vulnerability program from the last slide, this slide will kind of walk you through a process. So let's say, as an example, your organization conducts vulnerability scans once per week. Okay, so you're doing the scans itself. You turn over the reports to the team responsible for remediating the vulnerabilities. They determine the impact to the system. They document what the remediation plan will be. They look for risks. They look for rollback options in case it fails. They look at maintenance windows, priority orders, because you might need to bring systems down and bring systems up in a particular order. They're going to look for all of that. And ideally, your change request form is going to be comprehensive enough to capture as much, if not all of that data. And then anything else you can think of that is important to you as an organization, in case you want to go back and look at historical changes. If you have the ability, you want to test in a non-production environment. And when I say when available, it's because if you're a software development organization, you're likely going to have multiple non-production environments that you promote your code through. However, if you don't develop code, you're likely not going to have a non-production environment because there's a cost involved in maintaining a separate environment. Sometimes we see a hybrid model where you don't develop, but you have maybe a small lab or workspace or subnet carved out where you can, load an image onto a machine and test. So however it works for your organization, you just have to look at and see where you fit in this model. If you want to invest any money to give yourself a non-production environment, if you don't have one. But if you have that, that's something that you would want to test with prior to presenting to the CCB or CAB. Why is that? The change request form is great. But if you can go in there and deliver results of your testing, what the impacts were, and the environment was realistic and very comparable to the production environment, it's going to give the CCB or CAB a better understanding of what you've done to try to mitigate risk, and you're far more likely to get an approval. And depending on where you work and the type of clients you have, especially if it's federal government, federal contracting, the government themselves will likely be the CCB or CAB. So it's highly likely that they're going to require this before you even present to them. Otherwise, they're going to delay the approval until they see the results. So then your CCB and CAB meets to review and approve or deny or pause your changes. And this is what I mentioned earlier about pausing. There may be a case where you haven't provided enough information to the CAB or CCB, so they want more. So they're not saying no, but they're not going to approve it, let's say, for that current maintenance window. They may feel that the changes are too much in one go around and they wanted to break it up. You might also already have a full maintenance window and the changes you're requesting won't fit into that window. And then it becomes kind of a priority severity thing and you may get bumped. So a lot of different reasons why a pause could occur. But again, as I stated earlier, the important part here is making sure you have a way to document it so you don't forget about those. You will quickly go to another month and forget all about it. And then if you haven't provided whatever was needed to the CAB or CCB in advance, you'll miss that ability to get it on their review. Again, ideally security is involved. However, we often learn about changes after the meetings or during the meetings. So normally a security person will sit on a meeting and that's when you'll hear, I've never heard of this. How does this affect X, Y, and Z? And then you go to the pause mode. I think purposely this is made more painful than it needs to be, but it's done so that people will start to get into the habit that if they skirt the system or skirt processes, they're not just going to get an approval because there's a time restriction there. And hopefully over time they learn to include security up front. So then you implement this approved change. It often includes follow-on testing, monitoring, or a review of unknown or unintended impacts. So even if you tested in non-prod, you can only test so much until it hits the real world. You don't really know for sure if it's going to work or work as intended. So there's going to be some form of follow-on testing, and your CCB may ask you to come back in the next meeting, let's say it's in a month, and say, well, let's review the changes that were implemented. Were they successful? Did any of them need to be rolled back? And then all this is done, you now need to go update your baselines and all of your documentation to reflect the changes. Even in organizations where a program exists and kind of follows this process, these last two steps are the ones that are most commonly missed, overlooked, or neglected. It takes time to go back and update baselines, approve changes in the software, update documentation, pass out training if needed, etc. And usually as soon as you implement one change, you're already prepping for the next month's change and the next month's board meeting. So this is often overlooked, which over time means that your documentation just kind of falls apart and doesn't reflect current state. And then the last one, the enforcement of the new baselines going into effect, that's almost always skipped unless you bought software that will prevent the change from occurring until you approve it. In that case, it'll give you a list of all the proposed changes, and you can click approve or deny to all of them or individually, and then it will automatically update the baseline. And the next time you start, you're starting from the new approved baseline. So it can be done very quickly through software, but again, there's a cost of your time versus the product, and that's something each of you will have to look into. And last thing here, next steps and challenges. So at a high level, next step is you need to determine if the program makes sense for your organization. And as I said earlier, from a security standpoint, from an auditor standpoint, I believe there's not even a determination. It makes sense and it really should be required. Putting your business hat on, you may feel differently or want to delay things. I would, at a first step though, go look and see if you have a requirement to implement it through any of your contracts, your industry framework requirements, audit requirements, cyber policies, etc. If that's there, then that's an automatic. You need to do it, or you risk, losing insurance, losing a contract, etc. Very important to define the scope of the program, your key stakeholders. If you don't define the scope and the stakeholders, you will come up with goals and results. However, when you go through your gate reviews in this process, you'll likely fail them because the goals that you came up with were not realistic because the program just simply wasn't scoped properly and the right stakeholders weren't involved. You need to determine if this is a project you can take on yourself. It's large, it can be difficult, it can take a lot of time, it takes a lot of buy-in. If it's something you don't feel comfortable doing, I would highly recommend reaching out to an MSP, a VCIO, vCISO, etc. And then begin planning for a reasonable timeline. One of the biggest challenges I see from folks is that they underestimate the amount of time and the cost and the number of people that are involved, and they wait till the last minute, and then someone in their leadership says, I need this rolled out and I need it in the next 90 days. And to meet that goal, you don't put out an actual program that will be successful. So give yourself a lot of time. You may need to buy software, you may need to hire people, you may need to train people, etc. And then finally, the challenges. Obtaining executive leadership buy-in is often a challenge. Now, if it's being directed top down, that's not the case. But in a lot of instances, it's bottom up, where you're saying, hey, I have this requirement we haven't been meeting, and it's seen as, you know, a cost and not a real benefit. Obtaining proper funding can be difficult again. So use some of the, you know, the examples I gave earlier of why you have to do it as a way to you know, obtain that funding. You are likely going to get a lot of resistance from personnel. Employees do not like change. They do not like these processes when they're first implemented, and they're likely going to bypass them as often as they can. This happens all the time on the IT side, in the networking and system admin space, where I just need to implement this 2-second change. I'm not going to wait a month and go through all this, and they just do it. And if it's not documented, then you don't know that they did it unless you had that piece of software there triggering and alerting you. And then it's going to create additional workload, whether you outsource or do it in-house. In-house will obviously create a much larger workload, but you will need to establish what those roles and responsibilities are for each member of that program to determine what that workload is. And again, once you determine that, you're going to have to see, do you have the time and the skill set to do it, or do you need to outsource? On that note, I will pause here, see if there are any questions in the chat. Not seeing any. So if there are no other questions, I appreciate everyone's time as usual, and we will see you next month. Thank you.